Yep.
Um, Welcome to what we are tentatively calling peak hour.
Ooh.
Insights on transportation and planning. Some people's peak hour involves sitting in traffic. Ours involves sitting around talking about formulas, mapping, or what other transportation nerdy stuff we get into. Today's topic is transportation funding and prioritization. Our speakers are Teresa Robinson, the NCDOT STIP Western Region Manager, and Gretchen Belk, the Strategic Prioritization Office, or the SPOT Manager. Um, there should be, Gretchen, I think there needs to be more acronyms on your title,
I
more
couldn't
ways
agree
to
more.
purpose it. So, we are thrilled to have them today. We do have a chat section open for those attending. I'll try to keep an eye on it. But with that, Teresa and Gretchen, please take it away.
Okay. Awesome. Okay. Thanks, Tristan. So we're basically going to do like a little sandwich here. I'll open, talk a little bit about some money. Gretchen will cover spot, and then I'll cover stip. So without further ado, and we'll take questions at the end. This Peak Transportation Lunch and Learn, we'll be discussing a handful of topics, some background regarding transportation funding, the STI law, what prioritization looks like in practice, and how we program the STIP. So quick transportation funding background. We have a combination of funds that are provided through DOT revenue or NC North Carolina revenues and federal funds. And so the graphic you see on the screen is from the 2025-2026 budget. DOT gets approximately 76% of all of their funds through state revenues, such as the motor fuel tax, the highway use tax, DMV fees, and our general fund. And then that leaves about 24% of our revenues coming from the federal government. And this comes from the federal motor fuel tax, the general fund, and also random fees. And so, with all this money coming into the state, it is split up into two separate funds, the Highway Fund and the Highway Trust Fund. So, the Highway Fund comprises of all of our projects in the operations and maintenance side of the house. So, a portion of our state revenue, about 57% of all state revenues, will feed into the Highway Fund. And then that leaves about 43% of state revenues that will feed into the Highway Trust Fund, which funds all of our capital projects, also projects known as STIP projects. And so, as you can see in our yellow highlighted box here, the federal revenues that the state of North Carolina receives, 100% of those revenues come from the federal government, and those go into the trust fund. So this is probably a lot of information here, but the general gist is that between the state and federal funds that North Carolina receives as a whole, they are split between the Highway Fund and the Highway Trust Fund. And the trust fund is where we come in, as that's what funds our capital projects in the state. Okay, so projects in the STIP, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this schematic. I'm just going to click through here. So there are different, I guess, categories of projects that are in the STIP. A huge bulk of these projects are projects that are selected through the prioritization process, which Gretchen will talk to us about here in a little bit. There are three different tiers of prioritization buckets: the statewide mobility, the region impacts bucket, and the division needs bucket. The regional impact is 7 buckets that combines 2 divisions throughout North Carolina, and then the division needs is a 14 there are 14 buckets in the division needs category, one for each division. And these projects comprise about 82% of our funds. The alternate criteria projects, these are a handful of, well, a little more than a handful, but an okay amount of projects in the STIP that are selected through other means outside of the prioritization process. So some of them are funded based on or affect certain STI funding buckets, your statewide, regional, and division needs, depending on route eligibility. So for example, all of our interstate maintenance projects, these are affecting the statewide bucket. Our bridge replacement and rehab projects, those will impact the respective bucket on the road that it is on. So it can span the technically 22 different types of buckets, statewide, region, division. And then same thing with our safety projects. It's location specific based on the route eligibility. And then projects that are funded at the division needs category, typically majority of the MPO projects, the DA projects will hit the division needs category. The National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure projects, which there are not very many of those, and we're not sure if this program is going to continue, but those projects will be funded at the division needs category. Our economic development projects, transportation alternative projects, and our highway rail crossing projects are also funded at the division needs category. And these comprise about roughly 17% of all of our projects. And then lastly, we have projects that are exempt, and this is defined by STI law. They do not impact any of our 22 buckets here, and some projects that include these are our Appalachian development projects. I believe there is a couple that span y'all's area. Our CMAQ program, all of those projects, the carbon reduction program, and any projects that are funded with bonus allocation. So those funds do not affect any of the 22 buckets here.
All right, thanks, Teresa. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the STI law and how it structures what we do. In our previous slide, Teresa kind of started showing one way in which the STI law impacts transportation funding in North Carolina. But a little bit of background. So STI is the State Transportation Investments Law, and it really lays out how transportation funding in North Carolina shall be spread across projects. So through this, we have the prioritization process, or the SPOT process, that you all hopefully are familiar with. So here we're going to kind of walk through what that process is, where it came from, and things like that. So the STI process, we fund 6 modes of transportation in North Carolina. So highway, aviation, bicycle pedestrian, ferry, public transportation, and rail. And as Teresa kind of mentioned, we have an annual budget of $7.3 billion for transportation throughout the state. A lot of that goes towards maintenance, and we have about $4 billion that goes towards capital projects. So that's expansion, basically in any mode, expansion. So as part of prioritization, we do have our key partners. Those are our planning organizations, so our metropolitan planning organizations and our rural planning organizations, and also NCDOT's 14 divisions. These are our key partners because they are the experts on the transportation projects in their regions and areas, but also they are the submitters of projects for prioritization in North Carolina. All right, so taking a step back, let's take a look at the project life cycle. So first, we have an observation or a need. We see a problem. We say, hey, this isn't safe. We need to fix this. Then we'll go into transportation planning. That typically happens at a local level, where you try to start figuring out what are possible solutions to your project. Then once that's been developed a little bit further, you might bring in some coordination with your planning organizations, with your NCDOT divisions, and you've identified a potential solution to the problem. You want to move forward in actually implementing the project. Then comes our offices. So first we have prioritization, and then we have the STIP. And these are sort of a bottleneck that you can see with transportation projects, especially if you're going to be using funds from NCDOT or managed by NCDOT, because we are all about getting your project funded in order to move forward. So you have to go through prioritization, most likely if it's a capital project. And then once the project goes through prioritization and has been awarded funding, then it gets programmed in the STIP, which is Teresa's group. And then the project can move forward to the fun part. You know, you're actually starting your design, you're building the project, and then you get to maintain the project throughout its life. All right, so project selection reform, how this happened, how we got to where we are now. So prior to the STI law passing, there was sort of a perception that a lot of the ways in which NCDOT or North Carolina figured out what transportation projects to fund were done over on Jones Street. And it was a lot of conversations of, I'll help you if you help me kind of thing. Again, this is just a perception, not saying that this was occurring, but there was really a desire of folks to have more public involvement as part of the transportation project selection process, and also more transparency. So there were some studies done, some recommendations made in order to improve the process of selecting projects using NCDOT's transportation dollars. So what came of that was the STI law, which came about in 2013. And this law, the STI law, Strategic Transportation Investments, really focuses on a formal process for selecting transportation projects that must be systematic, must be data-driven, and then it must have quantitative data, it has qualitative data, multimodal characteristics, and it should involve the public and local input. So this law in a little bit more detail. First off, we're talking about capital expenditures across all modes. So that's mobility, expansion, modernization, those types of projects. Again, maintenance is a whole different world using totally different funding mechanisms and processes to identify those types of projects that will be funded. The STI law says that the way we identify which projects will be funded must be needs-based and data-driven. It directly ties funding to the prioritization results. So we go through this process of assigning scores to projects based on, how they score in the established criteria that we have, and then we have to tie the funding to those. So you can't just go through all that fun process and then pick whatever you want anyway. The law says you must go down the list. You cannot skip one and things like that. It also says what funding programs are subject to this law. So that's the Highway Trust Fund and the Federal Aid Program, which is what Teresa just mentioned. And it also establishes the use of a work group, which is a group made of various stakeholders in the prioritization process to meet every cycle and make sure that we are always continuously improving the program. So this is not a static program. We go through this process every 2 years, and we're always meeting in advance and trying to make the program better and the best that it can be. So these are all defined in the law. And so how this sort of works in practice is, first we have the STI law. That's our guidance and our guardrails. It says that we must establish the priorities that we have for transportation projects to be funded. Then we go through the process of actually having projects compete for funding. So we'll go through statewide mobility, regional impact, and division needs in just a minute. But the result of that prioritization process is going to be the STIP. And so the STIP is a financial planning document that covers 10 years in North Carolina. These are required by federal law, and it basically says what projects the department is going to be funded funding, how much they'll cost, and what year they'll take place in. So it's really a financial planning document, and it's us showing our intention, our capital program for the next 10 years. So the projects that go through prioritization ultimately want to be in this STIP document. All right, so a little bit more detail about the STI law. The law is very prescriptive in certain ways, and it allows a fair amount of flexibility in other ways as well. So the STI law very strictly discusses the funding categories and percentages. That's talking about, if a project competes in the statewide mobility tier, regional impact, or division needs. So those categories are established, and the fact that 40% of funding must go to statewide mobility, 30% to regional impact, and 30% to division needs. That's all in law. The project eligibility, so what sorts of projects are eligible at the various categories, is also established in the law. The law also says what the highway scoring criteria names must be. And then also the funding constraints. So specific rules that we have to keep in mind when the projects are being selected for funding. So those are all written in the law, but our work group that meets in preparation for a new round of prioritization each cycle has the opportunity to provide recommendations that are ultimately adopted by NCDOT's Board of Transportation on a lot of administrative elements of the program. So the scoring process is totally done by way of recommendation and adoption by the Board of Transportation. So, our 2-year cycles, the timeline, schedules, things like that. The highway measures and weights. So we know the scoring criteria names. So we have safety, benefit cost, economic competitiveness, etc. But we don't know how those must be measured, and we don't know how much each criteria weighs towards your overall score. So those measures and weights were recommended by the work group. Non-highway criteria measures and weights. So the STI law just says that there must be 4 criteria for each mode, but other than that, the work group has established what those shall be. Normalization is the funding allocation between modes, and also the local input process. So we know that local input is a big part of prioritization. And so how that is done in developing a project score is also something recommended by the work group and adopted by the Board of Transportation. So this flowchart is showing kind of how STI works with these funding categories and percentages. So 40% of the available funds for prioritization or for capital projects at NCDOT are going to go to projects in the statewide mobility category. And the focus of these types of projects is on, major large projects. So addressing significant congestion bottlenecks. And for these types of projects, your score is going to be 100% based on quantitative data. So we have a formula that is established by the work group and partially by the STI law for these types of projects. We are going to calculate a score for those projects based on that formula, and then that is going to be the project score. Next, we have 30% of funds available for projects in the regional impact category. And so regional impact projects are a little bit smaller in scale or function, you could say. And the focus of these is really improving connectivity within regions. So not necessarily a statewide connector, but something that's very important to connectivity within a region. And so for these projects, 70% of the overall score is going to come from that quantitative data, from that formula that's been established, and 30% of the project score is going to come from local input. And another really nice part of the STI law is that it requires that a project be scored from 0 to 100. So a good way to remember this is basically 70 points of your project is going to be quantitative data, and 30 points are going to be local input. And projects in this category compete against other projects within their regions. There are 7 regions in North Carolina. It is basically 2 adjacent NCDOT divisions together, which make up the region. So when Teresa was just mentioning buckets, these are 7 of the buckets, the 7 regions, and then there's the statewide mobility bucket. And as you would expect, the final category is our division needs category, which makes up the rest of the 14 buckets because each division competes against each other, or the projects in a division compete against each other. So this is the remaining 30% of funds. As you would expect, these are projects on a smaller scale than regional impact. So really looking at local connectivity here. And 50% of your project score comes from this quantitative data or your formula. And then 50% of your project score comes from local input. And another element of prioritization is that projects can cascade down. So if a project is eligible at statewide mobility and it is not selected for funding, it doesn't score high enough, it will cascade down to regional impact. The project will be rescored based on the criteria and the weights for regional impact, and it will have to go through the local input process to get its overall score, and then it can compete to regional impact. And then the same process can happen with division needs. So any projects that weren't picked up in the regional impact category cascade down to division needs and get rescored based on those criteria and weights, go through local input, and then compete again. All right, so here are the eligibilities based on category and mode. So this is just showing what types of projects are eligible to compete at these various categories. I think the main thing to note here is, highways, we're really looking at interstate projects, toll facilities, and military routes as the main types of projects that are eligible at statewide mobility outside of large commercial service airports and freight service on Class 1 railroad corridors. So expensive projects are eligible at statewide mobility, but not very many project types. And then I think the other thing to point out here is just on the other end of the scale at division needs, there is a lot of eligibility for project type. So there are a lot of projects that can compete at the division needs category just by eligibility itself and not even considering those cascading projects. So those are things to keep in mind. One thing of note is that all bicycle pedestrian projects are only eligible at division needs. And then also public transportation, if your service is not spanning 2 or more counties, it's going to only be eligible at division needs. So those are things to keep in mind because division needs has the smallest amount of funding traditionally, just because it's 30% divided by 14 into 14 buckets. And it's typically the most number of projects that compete in that category. All right, so here's what scoring looks like. So as we mentioned, there's quantitative criteria and qualitative criteria. So the quantitative criteria is the formula that's established for prioritizing the projects. And then the qualitative criteria is that local input process. So those are for the regional impact and division needs projects. Again, projects are scored on a scale from 0 to 100, and then project selection goes down in ranked order. So you fund the number 1 project, then the number 2, and then you just keep going down until you run out of money. There are a lot of caveats to that, and that's what Teresa's going to walk through in a second. But for the purposes of the law, that's the gist of it. Yeah. For the legislation, we do know the highway quantitative criteria, and so these are the names of the criteria. So congestion, benefit cost, safety, freight, economic competitiveness, accessibility, connectivity, multimodal, lane width, shoulder width, and pavement score. These all must be part of these are the highway criteria. They're, if there's other priorities, you got to find a way to put it in those criteria. And then again, the methodology used to calculate the criteria and actually what measures go into these criteria is done by the work group. And then for non-highway, it just must be a minimum of 4 quantitative criteria. So your quantitative score versus local input. So we don't have local input as part of statewide mobility. It's just our formula. So here's kind of an example of what that will look like. So we know that for highway projects, and then there's also some aviation and rail projects, there's going to be different criteria that go into a project score. They will all have various weights, and they will ultimately add up to 100% of your project score, which is going to be a total of 100 points. For regional impact, we have the same thing. So we have a different formula with different weights for the various criteria, but it's only going to make up 70% of your total project score. It's going to max out at 70 if everything scores the highest it possibly can. And then same for division needs, but it's only 50% of the overall project score. Then we have the local input process. So 15% of, well, let me back up. For local input, so it's 30% total for regional impact, and it's 50% for division needs. That is further divided in half. So half of the project's local input score comes from the NCDOT division where the project is located, and the other half comes from the NCDO or the MPO and RPO where the project is located. So local input, and basically you can also just call this points towards a project. So 15 points of your project come from the division local input, and 15 come from the MPO RPO local input, and then same with division needs, but 25% or 25 points. And so also just to note again, with cascading projects, you don't keep the same score as you go down. It's rescored using the criteria, weights, and local input assigned to the project based on what category the project is being scored at. All right, so this is just to kind of wrap things up and show how prioritization looks like in process. And then we'll turn it back over to Teresa to see what the STIP unit does with projects once the score has been established. So the first step of this process is project submittal. So we have our planning organizations that submit projects as well as our divisions. Then we have the spot office who works on reviewing the projects for eligibility, for reviewing the data for these projects and making sure that we're using the correct data for the projects. And then ultimately, we're going to calculate the quantitative scores based on the formulas that were established by the work group and adopted by the Board of Transportation for the round of transportation. Then we hand the quantitative scores over to the STIP unit. The STIP unit will do the programming for the statewide mobility funds. And Teresa will go into that process, so I won't here, but just to note, then projects cascade down into regional impact. The spot office will then recalculate those scores for those types of projects, and we will work on local input point assignments. So the planning organizations and the NCDOT divisions will see the scores and see the projects that were selected for funding at the statewide mobility tier. So you know which projects are competing and you know the scores of those projects. And then you will assign your local input points to the project. And then we repeat the process for division needs. So the STIP unit will work on programming the regional impact projects after they have their final scores. And then the remaining projects cascade down. The local input process occurs again, where points are assigned to those projects to calculate the final half of that project score. And then the STIP unit will program the remaining amount of funds available for projects in the STIP. And then the result of this process at the very end is a new STIP that will cover the next 10 years. And so just to kind of point out where we are now in prioritization, we are currently in P8, which is our 8th cycle of prioritization. The project submittal window closed last fall, so we are working very hard in the background in the spot office, validating data, checking project eligibility, working with many groups to get scoring measures that we need in order to develop an overall score for the projects. And we'll be starting the statewide mobility programming here in a few months. So y'all should be able to see scores and the likes of that here this spring. So we are well underway in P8, and we should have some exciting news for folks to see their quantitative scores and their statewide mobility programming soon. Yeah, and so similar to our process when we're completed in the spot office with developing the project score, we hand things over to the STIP unit to do the programming and to work with the money side of it. And they do a great job with that. So back to Teresa.
All right. Thanks, Gretchen. So if you thought that was fun, hang on to your seats because we're about to go deep into some weeds here. So our STIP programming process consists of 4 steps that can be generally summed up in establishing a budget, determining our funding availability, actually programming the projects that were selected through the prioritization process, and then a lot of back checks to meet federal and state laws to be in compliance with all the regulations that we have to follow. So again, this is our lovely graphic showing our revenue distribution between the revenues from the state of North Carolina and federal fund sources. So again, the STIP is only funding capital projects, and it is funded through the Highway Trust Fund. 100% of the federal funds feed into the trust fund, and then not quite half of state revenues are distributed to the trust fund. So once we establish a budget, we have to look at our 2 different fund sources, the state and the federal. So our state funding is based off of the consensus revenue forecast for the state, and the federal funding is based on recent apportionments. We are currently under the bill IIJA, the Infrastructure, Inflation, and Jobs Act. This will likely be redone in the fall of this year, or there could be continuing resolution. We're not really quite sure, but our federal funding is based on the current Transportation Act. Then we have to deduct certain line items from our budget. We take PE off the top, any sort of transfers that we have to other programs, and any funds that are considered exempt are also deducted from this initial fund. We also have to take into consideration inflation. And so the Board of Transportation will approve the inflationary rate ahead of each STIP cycle. Currently, we have taken not quite $5 billion off the top. And for this past STIP cycle, the board voted to consider or incorporate inflation at a 5% compounded annual rate for years 1 through 5 of the STIP. And for the back half of the STIP, years 6 through 8, just 500 million is taken off from the top for each of those years in the back half of the STIP. And then, like Gretchen mentioned, we have to follow the 40-30-30 formula in STI that distributes the remaining funds across the 22 buckets, your statewide mobility, your 7 regional impacts, and then your 14 division needs buckets. And then lastly, the budget has to consider the variance calculation. So this was established at the start of STI. It's essentially a comparison of the funds that have been budgeted since the beginning of STI versus what has been authorized. And this can be a positive or a negative value. So if one of the buckets was budgeted a certain amount of money, but they did not authorize that much, then they are credited that amount to that bucket. But on the flip side, if they have budgeted a certain amount and then overspent that amount, then that delta is deducted from the budget, and the result is there's less funding availability for that bucket for new projects. Okay, so which feeds into the next step is determining our funding availability. So this is essentially a formula taking the budget that we have established and subtracting all of the projects that are in the scheduled for delivery window per bucket. And so again, just as a refresher, your projects that are scheduled for delivery have their first phase outside of PE. So right of way, and if we don't have right of way construction, starting in years 1 through 5 of the STIP. And these do not include projects that have a status of funding for PE only, which are in the back half of the STIP. So these projects include projects that are selected through prioritization, all of our alternate criteria projects, such as your interstate maintenance, your bridge projects, safety projects, and the MPO selected projects. And so it is very critical that all of the projects in the scheduled for delivery window have up-to-date costs, that have correct schedules, and also accurate cash flows. Because as we change the project schedules, the projects might pay out in a different manner, and that will affect the funding availability on an annual basis, and also when we run calculations for fiscal constraint, which I'll talk about here in the next couple of slides. Okay, so once we have established how much money is available per each 22 STI bucket, then we are given a lovely spreadsheet by the spot office that determines all of the scores for the projects in their respective STI categories. So just because a project scores the highest doesn't necessarily mean that it will be programmed the first. So what a factor that we take into consideration when programming new projects is, where is this project in its project development cycle? If we haven't even started PE on the project, more likely than not, it's going to be funded in the back half of the STIP, and it's going to have to go through the prioritization process again. However, if you look at row 3, if we're about to break ground on construction, then this project is going to be programmed sooner rather than later because we're further along in the development of that project. And so again, it is a very methodological order in which we pick up projects to fund, but there's a lot of nuance as to where exactly in the STIP these projects are programmed. Okay. And then lastly, there are a handful or two checks that we have to go through to make sure that we are in compliance with all federal and state regulations. So the big one is our fiscal constraint that is applicable to every single STI funding category or bucket. So we have 2 different tests, the 5-year variance and the 10-year variance. Excuse me. So per STI, we have to, if for projects in the first 5 years of the STIP, per each funding category, we can be no more than 15% over or under our budgeted amount. For the 10-year variance, it's the 10-year program as a whole. We cannot be more than or less than 10% for each STI funding category as well. And additionally, per FHWA, we have to compare an annual fiscal constraint for each year of the STIP and to make sure that we are meeting those regulations as well. And then there are also other constraints that we have to go through and check for per STI. These are the big main ones that we have to go through again every time we program a STIP. So the corridor cap, which affects only the statewide mobility projects. These are projects that are only programmed at the statewide mobility tier, and they cannot exceed more than 10% of the statewide bucket if there's projects along the same corridor sharing two different divisions. So even if you have a project, take I-40, all the way through the state, you're not going to be comparing 40 in Division 14 and 40 in Wilmington and 30. They're coinciding counties. There are funding limits associated with the light rail and commuter rail projects, also limits to transit projects that are at the regional impact tier. For airport projects, there are caps per each funding tier category that we have to consider and make sure we are in compliance with. And then I think Gretchen touched on it earlier for bike pen projects. These have to be funded at the division needs category, and we cannot use state trust funds for these projects. And with that, I think we can open it up for a singular question because we dropped the plural. But I'm joking. We can certainly take multiple questions if there are multiples.
We do have a question in the Q&A from Joe. I don't know if you guys are able to see that. Joe asks, is there an opportunity for local nonprofit or community organizations to raise supplemental funds for a transportation project? If so, how does that inform prioritization of that project?
That is a great question. And you can provide supplemental funding for your project, and there are ways in which those actions do impact a project score. So benefit cost is a part of our scoring criteria, and excuse me, the cost that we use when we're scoring that piece of the project is going to be the cost to NCDOT. So if you are bringing additional funding to the table, you are lowering that cost, and you're lowering the cost that will be part of your benefit cost calculation. And then there's also a local contribution element to certain bike ped scoring, so that it's acknowledging when additional funding is being brought to the table. So encouraged, and it certainly is shown in the way projects are scored in prioritization that local funding or non-federal funding is a great way to help improve the score of your project.
The next question, could you discuss how the impacts due to Tropical Storm Helene has impacted the STIP?
Yeah, of course. That's quite a popular question. So surprisingly, since the STIP is funded through the trust fund, all of the repairs that were needed as a result of Helene have been funded through either outside of the federal funds like FEMA and emergency relief funds type thing, or through the highway fund. So again, the STIP is funded with the highway trust fund. So from a straight dollar perspective, there was not really an impact to the STIP because of Helene. However, from a scheduling perspective, because so many crews had to be picked up from their various projects across the state to go towards the west to reconnect water lines, power lines, fiber, etc. That caused delay to other projects from a scheduling perspective, just because of the sheer manpower needed that was diverted from other projects to the area. So really, it's more of been a scheduling impact than a monetary impact.
Great. Another question from Kenny Armstrong. What are the most common reasons a project that scores well does not advance to program?
You want to take that?
I heard scores and I was like, that's mentioned. So the biggest reason I can think of right now is money. So if we already have projects that are scheduled for delivery in that first half of the STIP, and they're consuming all of the funding availability per that STI funded category, that bucket, no matter if your project was the highest scoring project, if there's no money to pay for it, we can't program it. And that's what we experienced, at least in this region and my other divisions and regions in the West, where majority of our STI buckets just did not have the funding capacity to pick up new projects. So money.
Any other questions? Feel free to put them in the Q&A. Oh, Kenny again. Thank you, Kenny. What should local governments do early to increase a project's likelihood of advancing in SPOT? For example, corridor studies, feasibility studies, early design.
That's another great question. So I think when you're looking at a project and its likelihood of scoring high enough to be programmed in the STIP, one thing to consider is where is that project eligible? Is it eligible at the statewide mobility level, regional impact, division needs? And if so, or not if so, it's going to be eligible somewhere. But determining how the project will likely be scored. And I think what I'm getting at is, a lot of times priority project, I mean, they're found at all tiers. But say, for example, you have a project that is a major priority that's eligible at division needs. Your project absolutely needs local support, not only from your planning organizations, but also your NCDOT divisions in order to score high enough for funding, since half of the project score is going to come from that. So if you are working on coordination, things like that in advance, you can work towards getting half of your project score the full potential that it could be just based on that. So I really want to stress coordination and local buy-in at the planning organization and division level, just because both go into play when it comes to local input points. And then, any sort of studies, designs, things like that are very, very helpful to help understand what the scope and the cost of the project will be, which is really crucial in prioritization. But if you already have that type of stuff completed, then that can also help you get a better sense of how the project will score. So depending on the project type, we do have testing spreadsheets that are available in advance of the next prioritization round to give you a sense of how the project would score, given the characteristics of the project and how projects were scaled in the previous round. So that's for highway, but also with that information that you have, you could for other modes kind of look into the way in which the project would be measured, and then you can get a sense of things there. So yeah, I would stress local buy-in, coordination. Also, the planning organizations and divisions are truly the keeper of the keys for what projects are submitted. So to get your project in the door, you got to coordinate with them, and then to get it over the finish line, you're more than likely going to have to work with them to get those local input points on the project. So Coordinate.
Great. Matthew Manley asks, any outlook on future funding capacity for P8 or beyond?
Yeah, so we are in the middle of crunching those numbers. I believe they'll be released shortly before statewide programming sometime in May. So I can't give you anything yet, and that's also way above my pay grade. So even if I knew what magic goes on behind the scenes, I wouldn't quite be able to tell you yet. We are cautiously optimistic that we will have more funding availability in more of our STI buckets this time around, just because the department as a whole has done a lot better of a job to capture cost increases and more realistic schedules for our projects that are currently in the STIP. So hopefully this helps us paint an accurate picture of projects that are in the STIP. We won't have so many surprised additional requests for funds, as those are what also impacts our budget. If we initially start out thinking that right-of-way is only going to cost $1 million, and then all of a sudden we need 10, that's going to impact future projects for that STI bucket. So fingers crossed, we will be able to pick up more projects this next round of programming. But I'm afraid I can't give you any more specific answers than that.
Okay, more to come on funding. Anonymous attendee asks, what is the best way for towns or counties to coordinate with NCDOT division staff when shaping project scopes for prioritization?
So I think again, because towns or counties do rely on your planning organization or your NCDOT division to submit those projects, we would first encourage you to coordinate with your planning organizations there. A lot of times, not a lot of times, there is always coordination about projects with your planning organizations and your NCDOT divisions. I see Stephen Sparks on here with Division 13. He works a lot with these types of projects. So I think that starting with your planning organization would be a good way to make sure that you're getting the correct contact and going through the proper channels to develop that project scope. Also, one thing I'll point out for this round of prioritization through the work group process, there was a new adopted rule that projects submitted in the highway category will be required in P9 to have an express design, except for, there's a few caveats, a few exceptions for those lower cost, lower risk projects, but generally speaking, that is a great opportunity to work with the division and the planning organization to make sure that everybody is on the same page with a potential scope for your project and things like that in order to submit it for prioritization.
Great. And I think the last question from Mark Tooley, what role do comprehensive transportation plans play in the STIP?
And then we can kind of both talk to that. Yeah. So the CTPs are, at least from my understanding, your future outlook. This would be great to have. Let's get this down on paper, make it official that we want to improve whatever facility, whatever sort of need that there is. So the CTPs kind of help guide what projects could be submitted through the prioritization process. Do you want to jump in, or you want me to just keep going? Or, like, that's what I was going to say. So like I can only think specifically, there is a like niche federal fund source where they're going through the application, and part of the like scoring criteria for those projects is, is this on a CTP? So there could be value in getting projects on the CTP to chase after alternate funding sources, grants, whatnot, as part of, that scoring criteria. But what Gretchen mentioned earlier with her funnel slide, the CTPs are kind of at the top part of the funnel. And then as the project develops, goes through the scoring process, if there's money available and it scores high enough, then it'll get picked up in the STIP. And then that's where, we really start the project development process.
Great. Okay, well, we are just about at time. I want to give a big thanks to Gretchen and Teresa for their time and expertise on this. As a reminder for MPO and RPO folks, we will be talking about local input points for the regional impact tier coming up in June. So hopefully this webinar has helped inform you on some of the decisions that'll be coming up. But with that, thanks to everyone for attending, and we'll talk to everybody soon. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks.